Hello, everybody, and welcome back to another episode of the Speak Plainly podcast, where we speak plainly about things that matter. I'm your host, Owl Medicine, and today's topic that matters is the American healthcare system. I wanted to do a podcast on the American healthcare system, and I wrote an article a while back, or at least I started writing an article a while back, called A Brief History of the American Medical System, and I wanted to do a review from the turn of the century to now. And any time that you are digging into history to say something, where you begin matters as much as what you say. Here, in the story of the American healthcare system, what I'm really wanting to look at is the last 120, 150 years, and look at where we were in like the late 1800s to where we are now. The reason I wanted to do that is because there was one major event that shaped the future of the United States healthcare system in such a profound way that we are still feeling the ramifications today, profoundly. So today's episode is not going to be a complete history of the American medical system because that's just too much. I'm going to break this up into a couple of different parts, and today's part, we're going to focus on the early stuff, that turn of the century stuff. We're going to talk about the single most influential person in American healthcare. Funny thing, he's not a doctor. His name is Abraham Flexner. If you haven't heard of Abraham Flexner or the Flexner Report, let me show you how profound an impact one person can have just by being the right person at the right time with your brother in the right high-class positions. So, Abraham Flexner was the son of a snake oil salesman. His father made his living by pretending to be blind, deaf, and deaf. I almost said blind, deaf, and dumb. But no, he pretended to be blind and deaf to sell people snake oil at the approximate cost of one bottle, and it did nothing, admittedly, for the price of 1 month's wages. And his father would go around doing that as a snake oil salesman. Now, we first need to establish that the whole snake oil salesman thing is largely a Hollywood myth. There were a couple of instances of that, but ultimately, medicine at the turn of the century in the late 1800s to the early 1900s, medicine and modern science didn't have anything to do with medicine because it was brand new in the early 1900s coming out of Europe. Well, here in the United States, in the Wild West and in the Deep South and in these regions of the U.S., the people who practiced medicine had many different options that they could choose from. They could use osteopathy. They used a lot of plant stuff. They were even given classes, right? They were the classes of providers or the classes of the types of treatments that you could get were the eclectics and the osteopaths, the allopaths, and the homeopaths. Now, when we think of medicine in the Western world, we think of biomedicine is what it's called. And there's an interesting tidbit about that I'll get into later. That's a reference to allopathic medicine. And allopathic medicine is your MD. Your MD is trained, your typical MD medical doctor is trained in allopathic medicine. Doctors of osteopathy are trained in allopathic medicine, but they also have a holistic approach, and they learn osteopathic manipulation treatments as a form of intervention for their patients. At the time, allopathic treatments, allopathic providers, were the ones injecting high doses of toxic metals into people's bodies, and they were the ones who were bloodletting. So, it was allopathic medicine at the end of the 1800s that was killing people. Because of that, allopathic medicine was falling out of favor really quickly because they killed people. The other forms of medicine were harder to prove if they worked, and they were based, like homeopathy was based on taking small doses of specific things to try to get a large result from it. Osteopathy focused on dealing with the architecture and the structure of the physical body, and that the structure of the physical body would then help regulate the functions inside that body. And the eclectics were people who pulled, exactly how it sounds, pulled from lots of other stuff, but they were really heavy on plant medicines. And so the eclectics and the osteopathic people and the homeopathic, and at the time it was largely, most of them were largely either eclectic, homeopathy, or allopathic. 60% of the providers, and at this time, all practiced non-allopathic interventions because they killed people, and patients stopped coming to doctors that were doing allopathic treatments because the treatments were so aggressive that they would kill you. And there was a piece of satire at the time that was, I saw that was really great, a little cartoon that said, basically, you can, if you're sick, you can go to the allopath and die from the treatment, or you can go to the homeopath and die from the disease. And I think that's kind of funny to me, because that really does summarize what was happening at the time. So we've established now the people of the time were much more interested in getting homeopathic and osteopathic and eclectic or plant-based interventions because the allopathic medicine was killing them. Now, none of this was regulated. Okay, so like it was supposed to be. There was a regulation attempt in the 1840s and 1850s where they tried to regulate what was taught and licenses and getting approved by the state and all of that sort of thing. And they're just, I mean, it was the 1850s. There wasn't a whole lot of ways to enforce that, which meant that practically people were afraid of traveling salesmen and traveling doctors. They didn't trust them. You had to earn the trust of your community in order to be a provider. In 1860, there were 55,000 physicians in the United States, which at the time was 175 per 100,000. The majority of those physicians practiced osteopathy, eclectic medicine, and homeopathic medicine. So about 60% of the colleges at the time were for-profit colleges, and there really wasn't any barriers to entry. Anybody who showed up, who could pay the small tuition fees and study what they needed to study and pass the tests, would get their license and go on to practice medicine wherever they were. Until that changed forever. Enter Abraham Flexner. So, as I mentioned before, his father was one of those very rare actual snake oil salesmen. And I really think that had something to do with who he became in his life path. It's also, from here, easy to understand how his origin story and the fact that his father was a charlatan became the narrative that helped to push the quackery narrative that was used to shun all forms of medicine other than allopathic medicine. But how did he change medicine? So at the time, Abraham Flexner's brother, Simon Flexner, was the president at the Rockefeller Institute for Medical Research, which was brand new. All right, this is 1904. And this is important because for those of you who don't know John D. Rockefeller, you should. You probably at least know the name. The Rockefeller Foundation, John D. Rockefeller was and is to this day the richest man who has ever existed. Yes, ever. Tesla and Bezos None of them even come close. They're not anywhere near as rich as he was at his richest. At his richest in 1901, the man in 1901 was worth a now $400 billion. He was worth $400 billion. And how did he get that much money? Well, he has an interesting life story as well, but he got that money through oil. He owned Standard Oil. He created Standard Oil, actually. So at the time, when he created Standard Oil, cars weren't really a thing. Oil was kind of new. Plastics weren't invented. And he was like, well, this seems like a beneficial way I could make some money. But he saw that it wasn't a good idea to dive into the drilling because people were going bust drilling. So he just decided to buy a bunch of refineries. He bought refineries, would make some money, buy more refineries, buy more refineries. He even eventually started buying drills and drilling sites and that sort of thing. But by 1901, he was worth, by the early 1900s, he was worth $400 billion. And the United States government was like, this is insane. This guy controls everything. This is a monopoly beyond monopolies. We need to break this up. And they did. They broke up Standard Oil into 63 different companies. And that also happened in 1904. So all of this happened right around the same time. And of course, they knew this was happening because it didn't just happen overnight. The government didn't go, oh, he's too big, let's break him up tomorrow. That's not the way this kind of thing works. All these big money politics and all that, they take some time to get stuff accomplished. Well, part of the reason he was so filthy rich was it's not just the oil refineries. What he did then, the reason that there became a Rockefeller Foundation for Medical Research is because in oil refinery, you have all kinds of byproducts. Those byproducts we now call petrochemicals. Guess what the first pharmaceuticals were made of? Petrochemicals. They were made of the garbage left over from oil refinery that had no value whatsoever unless that garbage was turned into something useful and then patented. This is why there became a Rockefeller Foundation for Medical Research, as they were looking for ways to use the garbage from the oil refinery as medications. Great idea, right? Oh, and by the way, the 1890 to 1910, that's called the pharmaceutical era because that's when pharmaceuticals were first invented. So now you know a little bit about John D. Rockefeller and why there was a Rockefeller Medical Research Laboratory. And good old Simon's little bro, actually, I don't know if he was his little brother or his big brother, so I probably shouldn't say that. But his bro, nonetheless, had just written a book about how crappy the education was in the United States. Now, his brother, Abraham Flexner, the one we're talking about, he went to school at Johns Hopkins University. And Johns Hopkins University at the time was vying to become a power in the universities and in the education system in the US at the time. And they were using a lot of German laboratory science in their education system. And clearly, laboratory science is absolutely amazing, and that's what all of our medicine is based on now. This is why. There's a lot of pieces to this story, but follow me. It's really fun. So Abraham Flexner, he wrote a book that he published in 1904, and by the way, he was not a well-respected author. He'd written one book because he went to a college one time. And by the way, it wasn't a medical college. He opened a school in Kentucky, in Louisville, Kentucky, and somehow between writing that book and then opening his own school in Kentucky, he was that was like, oh, that's good enough. So because his brother Simon, they're the president of the Rockefeller Research, was like, you know what, my little brother would be perfect for this. And the Rockefellers were like, oh, that sounds great. Just to make sure he's not lonely, we're going to send along with him one of our guys. And that guy was named M.P. Colwell. And Flexner was accompanied by M.P. Colwell to ensure that the report that Flexner wrote would match the previously written and unpublished report from the American Medical Association. So Flexner and this MP Cowell guy went around to supposedly every single college in all of the United States and Canada in 1 year before cars were invented. All right, I want to just make that really clear. This super thorough investigation into American academics that then created the standardization all across the board was supposed to be thorough investigations of every single college and what they taught and where it was coming from and all of that sort of thing. Was apparently they went to every college in the US and Canada, and just in the US at the time there was 161, and that all across the country from East Coast to West Coast. And you're going to tell me that these two guys went to every single one of those colleges via horse and buggy in 1 year? I don't think so. Not happening. Okay, so let's talk about the report. Flexner's report was scathing. There was a lot of stuff in it that, like, he flat out said he was going to antagonize the eclectics, the osteopaths, and the homeopaths. He didn't like them. He thought they were crap, and it was him and this report that started referring to everybody as quackery. So, and this included everything. This was everything from chiropractic work to physical therapy. They investigated all of these and decided it was all quackery, and none of it was scientifically validatable using the new science coming out of Germany that they're teaching at Johns Hopkins University, which is where he went. And basically, the entire thing was, well, they don't teach the way that my school did, and my school is better, so they all need to go. And 10 years after the Flexner report, which, I mean, the Flexner report was released in 1910. It was published in 1910. So Abraham Flexner finished his report April 16th. Of 1910, which is one of the reasons I wanted to cover this now, because here we are, 130 years later, still contending. Here we are, over 100 years later, still contending with this stuff. Now, don't get me wrong. I do want to take a moment to say the state of medicine in 1910 was a mess. It was a mess, and it needed help, especially allopathic medicine. Bleeding people and dumping high doses of toxic metals into them was horrible. Where I think things went south is where they tried to eliminate all other forms of medicine. And we'll get into how that happened on a big scale in a second. But I think Abraham Flexner had the right idea. He saw that everybody was teaching kind of whatever they wanted. And it was so variable what you would learn that he was like, we need to standardize this. And I think that was a great idea. But I think they should have stuck to standardizing allopathic medicine, because allopathic medicine was the only one killing people. But that's not what happened. And that's not what happened because the Abraham Flexner report, along with that MP Colwell guy, they went around, looked at all of them, and said all of it's crap. The only thing that works is allopathic medicine, because that's the new science, and that's what we want to push. And so they were like, all right, everything that's not allopathic medicine is not allowed to be taught in the colleges that are being supported by the Rockefeller Foundation and the Carnegie Foundation. At the time of Rockefeller, 60% of all of the colleges in the United States were privately owned. And there were very little barriers to entry, like I said. Well, after the Flexner report, that changed dramatically. We dropped down to 10% of them were for-profit colleges, and they were systematically eradicated by the state government because it was the AMA working with the Carnegie Foundation and the Rockefeller Rockefeller Institute for Medical Research. It was all of them working together to set up all the rules. Like, well, let's back up a second. The AMA made it very clear if you're going to teach, you had to teach according to the AMA rules, and the AMA rules said blacks couldn't be doctors and women couldn't be doctors. So all of the black colleges got shut down except for 2 of them. So if you've ever stopped to wonder why there aren't very many African American physicians, this is why. In 1973, there was 1.7% of physicians were African American in the United States. 1.7 because of this. And by the way, Abraham Flexner, also a well-known racist, also said that blacks should only treat other black physicians and that it's below a white physician to treat black patients. So there's lots of issues with this, right? Lots of issues. But now, so the American Medical Association has always been pretty fucked up as far as I'm concerned. They started off saying no blacks, no women. And then after this Abraham Flexner report, doctors before this time were firmly lower middle class, according to a poll in the 1870s. Firmly lower middle class, and they helped out where they could, which if you have an off chance of killing people and your treatments aren't that effective, then it makes sense that you're kind of some lower middle class. But what happened is now allopathic medicine, they were getting upset because their treatments were expensive because the metals that they were injecting and the other stuff that in the quote unquote science that they were using was more expensive. And although there were fewer eclectics and homeopaths at the time, they were taking money out of the pockets of the allopaths, and they were like, we can't have this. And because of this whole systematic standardization happening, they were able to go, well, all of that stuff's quackery. We're not going to support that. And now the Rockefeller Foundation donated, I'm not kidding, the equivalent now of $100 million to all of these schools, to the American Medical Association, to these non-profit schools, because a for-profit school is run by the school itself. So if there are people who are willing to pay the tuition and go through the school and learn the things that they need to learn and then have a successful career afterward, then they'll just keep churning out doctors. A non-profit school, however, is run entirely by its board of directors and its donors. In this case, every single one of these non-profit schools that got any amount of money from the AMA, essentially from the Rockefeller Foundation and that $100 million that they sent out, they're like, all right, well, we need somebody on your boards to make sure that you're using our money appropriately. We want to make sure. So now every single non-profit school in the country has a member of the American Medical Association who is literally just who is funded by the Rockefeller Foundation. In every single one of these schools, the state governments worked together with the AMA and these nonprofit schools to shut down all of the for-profit schools. They even hired and worked with local city planners to squeeze out as many for-profit schools as they could, because the for-profit schools were still allowed to teach eclecticism. They were still allowed to teach herbs. They were still allowed to teach what they called historical evidence. Abraham Flexner said no more historical evidence. Anything that you've learned from anyone else is bullshit. Anything that you've learned from anybody, I don't care how long they've been treating, I don't care what they know, unless you were able to prove it in my laboratory, the kind that I learned graduating from Johns Hopkins University, unless what you're learning is provable by my extremely pathetic rudimentary science, then it's not real and is quackery and made illegal because it's unsafe. Any of this sound familiar? I get riled up about this. It pisses me off. it's really frustrating because I know what he was trying to do, and I feel like the rebel in him is like, I feel like he, like I said, he specifically word for word used the word antagonize. He planned on antagonizing all of the schools that he couldn't get to be outright shut down, because certain states had laws about it. They could outright shut down some of these schools, and they did. They shut down a massive amount of the schools in the Deep South and in the Midwest, leaving the Deep South and the Midwest completely empty of medical providers. Then they shut down all of the medical schools unless that school was tied to a research laboratory. Unless you were a school that was teaching European science, you couldn't also have a medical school. All of the medical training had to be tied to a university because the universities were doing the research, which cool. That brought money into the universities for more research. We got better science out of it, but there were a lot of other unintended consequences, or possibly intended, like doctors. At the turn of the century, before the Flexner report, we said lower middle class. Well, guess what they made after that? So doctors in the late 1800s were making about $600 a year. By the year 1900, they were making $1,000 a year, up from $600 per year in 1850. To 1928, allopathic medical doctors, the only legal kind now, were making $6,000. $6,000 a year is a lot of money for your basic family practice doctor during the Great Depression. So the incentive for allopathic providers to completely eradicate any other form of medicine from their toolbox was huge, because they were told that they were killing people and they were not using best practices and they were not using science. That they were somehow immoral for using interventions other than allopathic medical interventions, which I'll just say again were high doses of metal and bloodletting. These doctors had a huge financial incentive, and the Flexner report, in addition to all of the rest of the stuff, the Flexner report is the reason that you have to have 2 years of previous training. There's 2 years mandatory of anatomy and physiology. That medical school is 4 years long. The length and cost of medical school dramatically increased because they did not want poor, black, or female humans to become doctors. And so that's how they controlled it. But controlling doctors wasn't enough, because they needed to control and I think I've made this clear who the they is, but they being the American Medical Association and its funders, which were the Carnegie Foundation and the Rockefeller Foundation. And Carnegie made his money on steel. So the reason Carnegie was involved in this is because the Carnegie Foundation owned the very first patents for the very first pharmaceutical machines. So the Carnegies got to have the patent for the machines that made the pharmaceuticals, and the Rockefellers got the patents for the pharmaceuticals themselves. And it was way too obvious what they were doing, so they needed a safe little third party, which was perfect. Abraham Flexner, the brother of this guy who's on this medical research board of the richest man who's ever existed in all of time. And they're like, cool, let's slide him in. And now we have a, quote, objective third party to be able to push all of our crap. And now the only medicine that you learn in medical school is pharmaceutical. That's why. Everything is based on biomedicine, which is hilarious. Now, I recently learned doing more research for this. Like, I've known this stuff for a while, but I always try to do more research before I do a podcast so I don't sound like an idiot. But the term biomedicine was actually pejorative. It was actually an insult because biomedicine was a term used by the public to say that the new allopathic medicine treated such a small aspect of life. That it only treated the bio. It didn't treat the spiritual. It didn't treat the emotional. It only treated one small thing. So now we just refer to biomedicine. It's like, oh, biomedicine. That's the medicine. It's biology and medicine together. But it used to be an insult, which I find hilarious. So that's the Flexner report. After the Flexner report, they shut down over 50%. I think it was 54% of all of the colleges got shut down. The Flexner report also mandated that we have a maximum number of providers per capita in the United States. And guess what? Now the WHO, in 2007, the WHO adopted the exact same thing. Like the WHO literally adopted the Flexner report's suggestions for this is what good medicine should do. The WHO in 2007 was like, yeah, we agree with this 100-year-old idea that was born from the richest man in the world just trying to get richer, John D. Rockefeller. And the Carnegies and all of that stuff too. But the American Medical Association is garbage. The Carnegie Foundation, garbage. The John D. Rockefeller Medical Research Foundation, fucking garbage. And this is all why. They're like, yes, they do good. They did some good. We needed standardization badly. We needed quality education. We at least needed to be teaching like the same amount, like the same kind of anatomy and physiology. And we don't know exactly what was being taught in those schools because the Flexner report was not thorough. In fact, Abraham Flexner actually had to go to the American Medical Association's like command central in Chicago just to, as he went through and wrote all of this, he had to literally go through and be like, this was my work and this was the AMA's work, because the AMA, like I said, had this paper written on the state of the American medical education system in the United States. They had it written before they ever released the Flexner report. If you go and you can right now, I'll link them. You can compare the original American Medical Association's report and the Flexner report, which, by the way, like the Rockefeller and AMA guy, that was C.P. Colwell. Don't forget, he was there with him to make sure that he came up with the exact pre-prescribed end result. And that end result caused a dramatic physician shortage in the United States, mandated a dramatic physician shortage in the United States, and created such an issue that in certain regions of the United States, doctors couldn't take any more patients. They were seeing as many as they could. There's nothing, and then that's still true to this day. You just can't see a doctor because there's just not enough of them. But there's not enough of them because they literally purposefully priced out all of the for-profit colleges, all of the colleges that were able to teach, and you could show up. And so long as you had a willingness to learn, you could leave as a doctor and go to whatever region of the U.S. that you wanted and try to take care of the people there the best that you can. That's all that we're doing now. That's all anybody's ever done. It's just in the now, medicine, especially Western allopathic medicine, thinks that what they know and where they're at is the gold standard. It is God, and anything short of that is abuse and malpractice and quackery. And this is why. This is why it all comes from Abraham Flexner, who I think probably had a chip on his shoulder, and this was a little bit of the rebellion against his obviously fucked up father. And then his brother wound up at the right place at the right time. He wound up at the right place at the right time. And in case I haven't made it clear, Abraham Flexner, the man who is singularly the most influential person on the United States medical system ever, before the Flexner report, never stepped foot in a medical college in his life. He was not a doctor. He was not an allopath. He was not an homeopath. He was not an eclectic. He was nothing. He was an educator, and a pretty unknown one. So the person who changed everything about the medical system wasn't medical. All right, well, I think that's my time today. As you can see, I find this stuff very interesting, and I think it's really important. History is important. Understanding the context of how things came to be the way they are is important. And I hope I've made it clear that, like, there was a lot of bullshit that happened, like, and I really want to, hammer home the bullshit that happened because of the Flexner report. But it's... In my experience, you don't understand something unless you understand the good and the bad that came from it. And the good that came from it was a standardization of allopathic medicine, standardization of medicine in general. I don't think that was as great, but I do think the standardization of allopathic medicine and the standardization of teaching a somewhat similar program in all of the schools to become a doctor was probably a pretty good idea. How they went about doing it was absolutely screwed, and that's what happens when big money gets involved. Big money gets involved and it's like, oh, we want to do medical research. Why would the richest man in the world ever want to do medical research? Those are the important questions to ask. The reason is because he made more money on it. And what he wanted to do was make more money, because that's all people who make a bunch of money want to do, is make more of it. And they don't care. They really don't care about the impact that it has. They're like, this is good. We're doing good. And they did. Pharmaceuticals are awesome. They're absolutely invaluable in certain places and times. But they're not the end-all be-all. And the Flexner report changed American healthcare forever by pretending that allopathic medicine is the end-all be-all. And it's not. It's really, really amazing at getting you over crises, getting you through a crisis. But it's garbage at pretty much everything not critical. So that's today's episode. That's my little breakdown of the Flexner report. Abraham Flexner, his brother Simon, and the funding from the John D. Rockefeller Foundation, the American Medical Association, which if you didn't know how evil they are, they're fucking evil. Period. They've been racist and sexist from the beginning. They have done nothing but try to vie for power, and then they got that power, and now they wield it however they want. I hope you learned something. I hope you found this interesting. I hope that I've inspired you to start asking questions, asking some good questions, the ones that are going to get you interesting answers. Because reality is always stranger than fiction. And I don't think that the Flexner report is any different. So thank you for hanging out with me. I really enjoyed today's podcast. And if you don't know, we have a Patreon now. So if you really liked today's podcast, you can go on the Patreon, and all of the show notes will be linked into the podcast, as well as the Flexner report and the AMA's report. So if you want to support, go to Patreon. You can support me there. And I will see you all next week, where we will continue this theme of a brief history of the American medical system. And we will be talking about loggers and the first ever insurances in the United States. We all know that insurance in the US is fucked. Again, context is everything. So we're going to look at where it comes from, how it all showed up, and the major political events that shaped what we have now. Here's a cool fun fact. The first official medical insurance in the United States came as an idea because of cosmetics. If you want to hear more, come back next week. Love y'all. Thank you for hanging out. And remember, stay blessed, stay uncomfortable.